Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening around the world. I see folks continuing to enter the room here. So please, real people and even AI note takers joining us today. Please say hello in the chat if you're able to. Some of you might be in transit or on your way here and there to listen to this, but for those of you who can join the chat, please let us know where in the world you are today, what organization. We know we have a diverse mix of participants joining us, which is always exciting. So with that, let me say welcome on behalf of IDAC's Innovation Working Group. If you're not familiar with the International Data Alliance for Children on the Move, we will paste the link in the chat so you can learn more about this alliance and this project. Maybe that's how you heard about this session. The Innovation Working Group is co-led by Save the Children and UNICEF, and I'll be here on behalf of UNICEF's Frontier Data Network, facilitating today's session. We provide community building support for the Innovation Working Group, and I'm so glad that more than 350 folks have joined or have registered, at least for today's session, to either hear it live or afterwards, which I think is a testament to the interest in this topic. So if you're joining for the first time, let me just say the point of this series is to bring together practitioners and researchers like we have on the call, innovators, anyone trying to push the boundaries of how AI and new data technology can support children on the move and in areas impacted by displacement. Our goal is to foster more collaboration, action. We want to be able to surface new solutions here, find new opportunities, solve these critical challenges. So that's why we have a mix of technical experts, data owners, implementing agencies, regional, national actors, both as speakers and represented as participants on the call. So we welcome your suggestions for what else we should be talking about in these sessions, future topics. But today we are exploring how AI and geospatial innovations are starting to help us close critical data gaps at two important intersections of climate and migration. First, climate as a driver of climate displacement, of childhood displacement. And second, mitigating climate hazards for already displaced populations. We're going to be touching on both parts of that unfortunate continuum today. So to do that, I'm so glad we have, as you can see on the screen, Laura Healy from UNICEF and Teresa Miranda Espinosa from IDMC. They're going to share how both organizations are working to, there's Maria Teresa, are working to reveal the hidden scale of child displacement from weather disasters globally, and how they're looking to project future risk using LLM, large language models, and other approaches. So that's very exciting. We're going to hear about that. And then we'll hear from Dr. Jamon Van Den Hoek at Oregon State, who is going to be sharing what we would consider some groundbreaking work on developing this new global database of exact geospatial refugee settlement data, which can be enhanced with environmental, climatic, and socioeconomic indicators. The point or the value, one of the key values of this data set is that it gives humanitarian actors the ability to accurately assess hazard exposure, target food security interventions, and allocate resources where we have vulnerable refugee children who need them. So he'll talk about the vision behind this and how AI and other data technologies are helping. Okay, we've asked all of our guests to speak about their work so far, to let us know what's unfinished, and that's my invitation to all of you is to then help us figure out, to share ideas, figure out where we go from here. A lot of this work is very nascent. It's critical, obviously, but with the power and strength of this community, we believe we can surface potential new projects, new ideas, new collaborations. So we welcome that, in addition to your questions, which we will be doing after the presentation. So I'll remind us later, but you can start putting questions into the question Q&A button. Up at the top, there should be a Q&A button icon. And you can put those in at any point, but we won't get to them until a little bit later. So with that long preamble, welcome again. And I'll put some additional bios in the chat, and we'll hear a little bit more self-intros from our presenters as well. But I just want to get us warmed up with a kind of an opening round from everyone here, just to give us a sense in your own words, what's the primary gap or challenge in our current data systems when it comes to accounting for the millions of children displaced by floods, storms, droughts, other climate or weather-related disasters? Laura, how do you come at this question from UNICEF?
Thanks, Michael. So from UNICEF's side, the biggest challenge really for us is that children displaced in the context of climate change by weather-related disasters are largely statistically invisible in our data systems. We know that millions of children are uprooted from their homes by storms, floods, droughts, whether it's displacement in the face of disasters, whether it's preemptive evacuation or part of planned relocations. Mobility can look quite differently, but whether it's short or really extends for years to more protracted displacement, we know that it dramatically amplifies risks for children. They can be separated from their families and caregivers, exposed to violence, exploitation, including trafficking, lose access to school, health, and also basic protection services. Yet, despite this, most displacement figures and displacement data is not disaggregated by age. And in contexts of urbanization, of fragility, of conflict, children are even more likely to fall through the gaps and be off the radar. We simply don't see them. And that means we can't identify those who are most at risk. We can't target services and resources, and we can't ensure that those who are most vulnerable are prioritized in efforts to prepare, efforts to plan, and efforts to respond in the context of climate-related disasters. And this data gap really has huge implications. It means that we're not prepared for the scale of child displacement and the impacts that climate change are already bringing. Children on the move are not yet on the agenda at COP30, where world leaders will meet, in a matter of days. And in addition to that, only 2.4% of global climate finance is directly channeled to child-specific solutions. So while we know they are disproportionately impacted, that lack of data, that lack of visibility really impedes efforts to respond, to plan, as well as to resource the kind of interventions that we need to see to address the challenges that we face when it comes to children on the move.
Thank you. Maria Teresa, I imagine you see it probably quite similarly, but give us your perspective as well, if you would, from IDMC.
Yeah, the perspective that we have at Internal Displacement Monitoring Center goes in the same lines. For several years, we have been flagging that there is a basic lack of baseline data in general from disaster-induced displacement, because disasters are highly underreported. And then at least the total number of people living in situations of displacement and displaced by disasters. But on top of that, the disaggregated data is not available. Whenever there is data that is published, sex and age disaggregated data is not present. But what is the meaning of this? It has so much implications and impacts on targeting aid, but also then understanding and planning ahead and changing the switch from reactive to proactive in the way that humanitarian work and also disaster risk reduction is focused, right? So I will say that the main gap, the main challenge that we have is the lack of consistent baselines on internal displacement triggered by disasters. And because especially after the emergency phase of a disaster. When a disaster hits and there is an immediate response, there is a lot of information that is published. But after the emergency phase of a disaster, during the next parts of the disaster recovery cycle, there's almost no information that is available.
Right.
So we don't know how many people are displaced, for how long are displaced, and what are the needs they have. Then another layer is the way in which we collect data. So far, we still rely on very conventional methods to collect data, on the ground assessments, media monitoring, but there is a lot of technologies and advancements that happen in the last years with new and unconventional data sets that we could explore, but they are not available at the scale. And most of the publications from academia or the humanitarian sector focus on pilots, but there is nothing that can be scaled to all the disaster events that happen worldwide, and that could help us give a global picture of what is the magnitude of people displaced by disasters. And as a result, the information that we publish, because the organization that I'm representing, the Int'l Displacement Monitoring Center, does not collect primary data. We aggregate evidence from multiple sources, and we provide global statistics on the baseline and how many people are displaced every year. So as a result of the gaps that I mentioned before, almost all the estimates that we publish are underestimates. And therefore, we don't have, as Laura mentioned before, a clear picture of what is the magnitude and what are the specific needs of the population displaced.
Thank you. Yeah, it's you state the problem quite clearly. Both of you have. And Jamon, I know you're on you're looking at it from you've been looking at the gaps from the context of people who are already displaced and children as part of that. Tell us what you see as as one of the central challenges you're facing or seeing.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I totally would just echo what Laura and Maria have already said. The lack of visibility, the lack of currency, the outdatedness. We're always too late. We're always too localized. Often these monitoring programs end prematurely as well. So those are all real challenges. I would just maybe add to that by saying that though we have more data sets at our fingertips than ever before, most of these are not fit for purpose for these kinds of environmental and climatic hazard or socioeconomic or infrastructural or demographic assessments we'd like to do. And we don't know the ways in which they're not fit, and we don't know where they are appropriate and where they're not. So most of these products that have been, the data sets that have been produced, do not have displacement settings in mind. They don't have often lower socioeconomic settings in mind. They certainly do not have specific dynamically moving populations in mind. They're meant to be agnostic. They're meant to be useful in multiple purposes, which is great. But these topics we're talking about today end up falling through the cracks in terms of how well they're represented in these data sets, demographically for sure, but in terms of displaced populations just in, say, national climate adaptation planning, I mean, virtually absent, right? Almost completely absent. So there's a whole host of reasons for that, but at the end of the day, we just don't know which product an analyst, a refugee leader, a practitioner wouldn't know which product is appropriate, if it's a global scale, if it's a continental scale, if it's a regional scale for application in their particular area. If they're not vetted in that way, there's no metadata to describe that. And so what we end up seeing is application of data sets that are inappropriate for their use, or the worst would be a scenario, and I certainly don't have any, I'm not speaking of a specific scenario here that I know of, but the biggest concern would be that based on some data set that looks good, say at an appropriate level of accuracy at a global scale, would introduce maladaptive responses at a local scale or at a regional scale. That would be the biggest concern, where things actually get worse from making decisions based on these data. It's not that it's 80% accurate instead of 90%, it's that actually the wrong decisions were made altogether. So that's something on the horizon that, there's more and more and more data sets, more and more tools, but I think we lack the connectivity and we lack really the frame of mind from the data producers to think about the breadth of applications that their data may be used for, and to say really explicitly, don't use this for this kind of analysis at this scale.
Right.
It's not appropriate.
Not appropriate,
and we're seeing some of that in ecological space, but in these applications we're talking about here, it's not really picking up yet.
I wonder, just for those, just a quick follow-up to all of you, as for those who are newer to this space, you kind of all referenced different data not being available or fit for purpose, and I'm curious if there are any examples. We're not calling anyone out, but the types of data that a practitioner would find in your shoes would find to be insufficient or lacking. Kind of a specific, typical data set or source.
If I can jump in, I think that there is a general lack of temporally and geospatially disaggregated data. Metadata is a very good point that was just flagged, because in order to use a data set, in order to take decisions, we need to know where the how the data was collected, what are the caveats of the data, the limitations, methodological changes, if the data can be used to compare different temporalities of the data, like multiple years, right? And I will say that in general, this is something that we struggle a lot in the area, and there's a lot that is still a lot that can be improved in terms of filling gaps, getting better at providing metadata. Most of all, now that we live in the era of the hype of AI and new technologies that can solve multiple problems. In order to solve a problem, we need the adequate data, and we need to be aware of the bias of the data, because what was just flagged is that we can actually worsen situations by using the wrong data. And that was a very good description of the current data landscape. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate you giving some of those specifics to help ground it further. Anyone else? We don't need to do a full round, but anything else top of mind to share?
I can come in just quickly. I find there is a lot of data modeling out there around risk, but really what we are looking for is to identify those communities where the risk is high and the coping capacity is low, and the data to really give us that picture of coping capacity, or bring together different variables, whether it's mapping schools, for example, and using that as a proxy for resilience in the context of children specifically, or being able to overlay to really pinpoint where we want to ensure that we're targeting our resources and our efforts. That is, from my side, certainly a gap that we have seen.
Yeah, great. Well, with that, you all have been working on, you're all here because you have also specific projects, ideas, and work to address some of these challenges. And so we're eager to dive into those now, and hear about the technology, the strategy, and the potential and the impact your work is starting to have, and then of course to look ahead at what's not yet done and what still needs to be done to help these projects further work for children. So we'll start with we'll go over to Maria Teresa and Laura to share first, and we'll hear from them for about 10 minutes, and then we'll go over to Jamon and hear about his team's work as well. So I'll let you switch to turn your slides on and take the mic. Go ahead, Maria Teresa.
Thank you. Let me start introducing and presenting some numbers and the work that IDMC does, because it's going to be a good segue to the next speaker, the work that UNICEF is doing with some of the data sets that we have published. At the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, we, as I said before, we collect and aggregate and harmonize data that is published by a plethora of sources. Our catalog covers around 3,000 sources and publishers of data and evidence on internal displacement. So the core of our work is to make to aggregate all this information, to make the information, to standardize the information and make the data comparable and usable and then accessible by multiple end users. Last year, our global report, as part of our global reporting, we estimated that the total number of people living on situations of internal displacement were around 83.4 million. And I'm starting with this number because it's important to understand why internal displacement and children in the context of internal displacement are so important. It's because the total number of people displaced is 2 times higher than the total number of refugees reported also in the same year. But whenever we try to answer the question of what is the scale of internal displacement, specifically triggered by disasters, the estimates that we report are quite low. As you can see on this chart, there are 2 lines that represent different time series. The orange line represents the total number of people living in a situation of displacement triggered by conflict, and the blue line represents the total number of people reported as displaced in the context of disasters. And you can see the big difference. And there are multiple explanations for this difference. The different characteristics of displacement, the duration of displacement, the severity and vulnerability, because the triggers are different. But these figures also show and illustrate a big gap. And as we discussed just in the introduction, internal displacement triggered by disasters is highly underreported. And then another thing that we need to keep in mind is that we need these figures. We need to know what is the baseline, how many people are displaced, when and where. But we also need to change the reporting and the analysis to use a forward-looking assessment of internal displacement, to try to focus as well on the future and try to estimate who could be displaced or affected, not just now, but also from emerging crises. So the next slide illustrates the workflow that we have in IDMC. As I mentioned before, we don't collect primary data. We are data aggregators. We have a database and a specialized team of analysts that collect and analyze information. We track different triggers, drivers of displacement. We collect and harmonize information that is collected and published in multiple languages from multiple contexts using different terminologies. And we harmonize all these. And the data that we publish goes through multiple quality control process, including peer review by main UN agencies and the different partners and organizations that we work in different contexts. And at the end of the workflow, we publish the data as public good in open APIs, and all the data that we collect is publicly available. And as part of this work, as I mentioned before, we collect the baseline, the statistics that can allow us to understand how many people are displaced, how many children are displaced worldwide. But as I said before the reporting, or beyond the reporting, sorry, we need to also try to understand what could be the probability of people being displaced. And for that, we developed a multi-hazard risk model that provides estimates of how many people are at risk of being displaced in average in the different countries that we monitor. And the coverage that we have is global. And there are multiple applications of this model. It's not a forecasting model. It's most of all a model that helps you to understand the global risk. And as I presented at the beginning, probably the results of this model are also underestimates, because the data on the people displaced by disasters are it's lacking in multiple contexts. And I would like to stop here because Laura is going to present more details about the model and how the model is being used by UNICEF. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria Teresa.
Thanks so much. So I'm going to just give you a bit of a snapshot of how UNICEF has been working together with IDMC to really leverage all of the data that's been collected and correlated on IDMC's system to develop a model to actually determine how many children or estimate how many children have been displaced due to weather-related disasters. And this effort is really to shine a light on what we know has been such a big gap, because this data is not disaggregated. And so we wanted to see what's possible to bring together or to overlay gridded population data with the historical displacement data between 2016 and 2021 in a global analysis. We looked at several specific hazards, so floods, storms, droughts, and wildfire, to find the share of children. And with this historical data methodology, we know that the data isn't systematically available, so most available for large events in countries with stronger data systems, whereas there are big gaps in some of those countries with a weaker data system that are less able to track. And it also includes preemptive evacuations, which we know can be life-saving in many contexts, although often children may still face the same vulnerabilities as being displaced. So often countries with better preparedness plans and better disaster risk reduction will have more preemptive evacuations. And then to complement this, we also used the future risk model to identify the potential displacement risk of children, looking at 3 very specific hazards. So looking at riverine flooding, which doesn't include coastal flooding or flash flooding, looking at cyclonic winds, which is just one part of a storm, and similarly storm surge, so the waves that are caused during a storm. And again, just overlaying with the gridded population data in order to try to estimate the number of children who could be displaced in the next 30 years. And unlike the historical data, this does not include preemptive evacuations, and it also takes into account those once-in-a-lifetime disasters that may not be captured from a historical subset of 7 years, 6 to 7 years. And so we found that between 2016 and 2023, which is the latest update of the analysis, there were 62 million internal displacements of children due to floods, storms, wildfires, and droughts. So this is the equivalent to 21,000 displacements per day. 95% of these were due to floods and storms, while it was 1.3 million were found to be due to drought. It's much more difficult to collect drought-related displacement data, and so this is somewhat related to being easier to really measure the number of displacements as a result of sudden onset disasters. 3 countries stood out as having the highest number of child displacements, and this was the Philippines, India, and China. But we know that they have very strong or relatively strong data systems to track displacement. And so we thought, what story is this data really telling us? So we also looked at what does the data say when we look at the numbers relative to the child population. And when we did this, we saw that small island developing states, as well as countries in the Horn of Africa, were by far the most impacted. When you look at small islands like Dominica, for example, it was the equivalent of 75% of the child population in the number of displacements. So how do you prepare an education system where the risk is that great and children are going to be displaced and returning and displaced multiple times? This mapping here gives you a snapshot of what the data looks like. So those red dots that you see there are really the hot spots where multiple displacement events have occurred. Floods caused 19.7 million new child displacements between 2016 and 2021. And then here you see the storms mapping, similarly with the hotspots in red. And the countries listed on the right, so Dominica, Saint Martin, Northern Mariana Islands, Cuba, Vanuatu, are those countries that are most affected, experience the most displacements relative to the child population. So I think Vanuatu was close to 35% of the child population in number of displacements. And then looking to the future, there are an estimated 114 million potential displacements that could occur over the coming 30 years based on the risk model, the most being due to riverine flooding, which could be potentially 96 million internal displacements of children over that 30-year period. And then building on this global analysis, we really wanted to make it useful and contextualize it to different regions and countries. So we've since done 2 regional analyses, one in Eastern and Southern Africa, focusing in on key high-risk countries and developing costed action plans with the government based on that new data. And then in South Asia, also a new data analysis, which takes all of the countries in the region and actually maps out all of the high-risk areas and hotspots in order to inform policymaking, as well as program delivery in those countries. And so how are we using this data? We really want to use it in order to better prepare and minimize risks for children. So this means using it to identify where the risk is high and the coping capacity is low, really using it for multi-hazard risk analyses together with communities at risk to target efforts to plan and prepare. We want it to inform inclusive early warning systems, so reaching those already on the move, but those who are living in these high-risk areas where displacement risk is very likely. As well as preemptive evacuation plans, planning where children and families will move to, ensuring that we're not using schools which will further disrupt education, and making sure there are those flexible financing and partnerships available following a disaster in order to support displaced populations, and preparing systems and services for children. So education, health, child protection, ensuring that they're climate resilient, they're inclusive, and they're ready to reach and absorb displaced populations. So supporting the social service workforce to be able to move with children and families, deliver mental health and psychosocial support to those who are displaced and separated from their families, from their caregivers. And then finally, really using this data, this evidence base, to try to influence policy and financing decisions when it comes to climate change, but also humanitarian development policy and financing as well. And as a next step, we're really exploring how we can build on this to unpack the links between conflict and climate and displacement for children, which would be a really good next step in terms of unpacking the complexity around displacement and how different factors really contribute to vulnerability in order to help us better prepare. And this final slide just gives some food for thought for those who are working and interested in the data space around what can we do? What do we need to think about in order to address some of these gaps? So firstly, really strengthening data systems where we can to better plan for, track and monitor children as they move. Really leveraging existing data to help predict and prepare. And as mentioned earlier, ensuring that it's the right data, then forming good decisions in order to better reach displaced populations and better provide the services that they need in order to build their resilience and protect their rights. But using the data that we do have available, oftentimes there is data there that's not being used necessarily, particularly within the climate space. Displacement data isn't necessarily factored in, and there is a big opportunity to really use what we have. Ensuring that data is disaggregated, of course, age, sex, also migration and displacement status, where that makes sense. And then investing in more evidence generation to actually influence better programming decisions, better interventions for governments, really ensuring that evidence is a part of our core ask in our efforts to step up this work, because it's so critical to really shine a light on those most at risk and inform decisions in order to best prepare for mobility in the context of climate change. So I will stop there and welcome any any decisions or inputs. Or over to you, Maria Teresa, to complement, please.
Thank you, Laura. I think that you laid down very well different points that are very important to keep in mind moving forward, but I would like to add two more. One is to also support the collective effort to collect data and protect the data ecosystem, because something that it has become more evident since the last year and the massive defunding of the humanitarian sector is that even the data collection of primary and essential data sets are at risk. And in order to take informed decisions, we need to protect the data ecosystem. So that's the first point. The second point that I would like to add is collecting highly disaggregated and temporally relevant data, because information and decisions about funding, forecasting-based financing, anticipatory action, or even early response to disaster require quick, disaggregated data that can help us understand where do we need to focus the resources that we have available. Thank you.
Thank you for adding those calls to action. Thank you both, Maria Teresa and Laura. I've added your bios to the chat for those who want the fuller introduction to your background and work, and would just remind colleagues to please start noting questions that have come up to you as you've listened in the chat, or sorry, in the question and answer, not in the chat, but in the Q&A section. You should have a button at the top of your screen, and so that we can start collecting those, especially while they're fresh, before we go to our next presentation. So with that, I will pass the mic over to Jamon.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Maria Teresa and Laura. I will share my screen here. Is coming through okay?
Almost. Oh, I think it will be as soon as you start. It says loading.
Yeah, me too.
Must be a. There we go.
Let me know when that's good to go. There we go.
Good to go.
Thanks for the introduction and the invitation, Michael. So this project, as Michael alluded to, focuses on trying to better spatialize global refugee settlement locations, places, spaces, and we're doing so by curating a global data set of boundaries. Now, this sounds sort of like a mundane task, and don't we already have this? But we don't. Right now, we are quite hobbled, I would say, from a geographer's perspective when we think about over 1,500 global refugee camps, and mainly what we have is a point location to represent these on the global map. So we're trying to do this to better understand the kinds of follow-on concerns that we've all been talking about today. This is a geographic issue, a spatial data question, but once we open this up, we can address a lot of these very currently concerning, but especially worrisome trends going into the future. Now, this is, of course, against this context of global rising displacement trends. We have a global record of refugee settlements and camps. We have a global record of refugee population and children refugees. So we have, of course, children right at the front lines of climate change, rather, in these refugee settings. But as I'm sure most of you already know on this call, these are not temporary situations. We still struggle quite a lot with addressing these long-term, we would call protracted displacement scenarios, supporting third country movement, supporting repatriation, urban integration. All of these, it's an uneven terrain globally, but these are all still very challenging topics. This is against, of course, as Maria Teresa alluded to, some of the lowest ever, even before the complete dismantling of U.S. aid, lowest per capita support for refugees, there was a new low of $47 per refugee in 2023. So we're really trying to do a lot more with a lot less. And one of the challenges that we have is we generally know where refugees are, but when we try to understand climatic risks, environmental exposure, or just some of the key things that deal with the day-to-day experience of refugee children, such as proximities to critical infrastructure, schools, clinics, hospitals, other opportunities as the child grows, not just natal care, but opportunities for children as they live their childhood in refugee settlements, which is increasingly the case. We don't have a good sense of whether, for example, something's a half an hour walk or an hour walk or a 3-hour walk. And we don't know that because not only do we not know necessarily where a refugee child may live in the settlement, we just don't know where the settlement begins and ends, quite bluntly. This is a global map of locations, but our work is trying to take all of these locations, which are commonly referred to as centroids, but these are not always centroids. They're not the exact center of locations. They're a representative location. It could be a storehouse, it could be the main road, the intersection coming up to a camp. It could be off as well. These data, we increasingly find 10 to 20% of these available UNHCR point location data are difficult to even place some of where these camps are. This is something UNHCR is working on, of course, but as data users who want to do something with it now, we're stuck in some cases to be able to know what's happening. So we want to take this point location view on the left and generate a camp boundary data set on the right. And this is what we've been working on over the last year. This is our lab here, the Conflict Ecology Lab, works basically on these two sides of the coin, the geospatial data quality assessment, but also looking at conflict processes such as war impacts and forced displacement through geospatial and Earth observation lenses. So this is really a culmination of a lot of previous work where we hand curate these boundary data sets in settings like Uganda, Jordan, or Thailand. And now we want to just basically generalize this. We want to take the lessons that we've learned over multiple projects and scale this up. So we have these point locations where, of course, we can see things on the ground. The delineation of these boundaries, however, is extremely difficult to do through automated, I would dare say impossible with today's technology to do this across such a variety of conditions. These are just 3 snapshots, but it's extremely diverse in terms of the morphology, the layout, the topography, the built environment, what materials are used, how they're arranged, all of these things. It's very, very, very difficult to track this from an automated approach. So we've just basically gone back to the well and said, we're going to do everything by hand and trace all of these out and have actually multiple people trace all of these out so that we can compare multiple assessments, figure out what really makes the most sense, and then share these with and ask for feedback, explicitly ask for feedback from local managers, as well as others who are aware of what's happening at the local level. So we're scaling this up. We have a small subset of already basically identified planning boundaries from the UNHCR, which are not exactly the same thing that we're going after, but close enough. So we were able to use these to sort of compare what kind of results we got to what UNHCR tracked, mainly through on the ground, but not always, techniques. And we see very high agreement there. On the left, this plot, you want to see that kind of diagonal distribution. And sure enough, we see a good agreement there. We also have looked at this. This is just one plot showing terms that are going to be familiar with everybody's size, area, perimeter. But we've looked at a whole host of geometric considerations, like the complexity of the boundary, the jaggedness, the sharpness, the roundness. We've looked at this in about 15 different ways. And really across the board, we're doing quite well in terms of matching what we know to have already been mapped from UNHCR. So we're at a spot now where we're seeking input. We have a Google form explicitly requesting input from researchers, refugee leaders, and humanitarian practitioners to help us guide these next steps of what variables and data sets we should. Now we have the boundaries, right? Boundaries are great, but what we want to do, going back to our very beginning slides here, and really tying in well with the previous presentations, I think, is incorporating these other data sets that we can measure, that we have confidence in their ability to detect these local and regionally variable conditions, not just what's at the camp, but what's happening within the camp. With these very large camps, that's especially important. The differences in flood risk potential, the differences in slope, the differences in access, infrastructural access, all of these vary, right? To some extent, is that variation matter? Yes, especially when we have really, really large settlements. So this is just a short list of not data sets, but variables that we've identified that we think are important. We want to share these out with the broader community. Once we have this, we hope that this data set serves, we're going to do some initial tests with AI boundary delineations to see how well this compares, but really what we see, this is just seeding this core foundational data set so that other researchers, other practitioners who have their own data, who have their own methodology they'd like to test out, can work with this core standardized data set and take it in new directions that we have no idea about. So this is really trying to offer up a bedrock data set that is globally consistent, is vetted, and has transparency and accountability and contacts. We really do want to know if we've made a mistake and where these boundaries are. We really do want to know what variables to track. So that's where we're at. This fall, we have this poll that's going to be going out to a small subset of likely end users. We'll expand that to just a publicly open poll next month. And then we expect to have all of these variables together in hand in the next 6 months or so, and hope to be able to share more then when we can actually have a data set ready to share that's beyond points, but actually is fully attributed geographic boundaries at global refugee settlements. Thanks very much. Here's my contact information, either email or the lab website. We have input there. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jamon. And yeah, feel free to also drop we can put your email into the chat, since we know there's, or all of your emails into the chat, given the explicit request for input and feedback there. Thank you. We have some questions, and we have time for them, fortunately. So I want to start with, there's one that I'll actually just ask us to take via comments, just about the relationship between UNICEF and IOM, and Sebastian Palmas, who is with the IDAC Secretariat, has added a comment, but I'll invite Laura and Maria Teresa to jump in there into the chat when you have time for that question. For the group, for right now, I'll read one from Manuel Garcia Herranz, who poses a question about droughts, flood, storms, and wildfires, which all have very different timescales and seasonalities. And given that, is there a good way or method to establish causality for climate-induced displacement of such different events? Any thoughts or reflections on that?
It's okay if I
Maria
jump in?
Teresa, I see. What's that?
It's okay if I jump in?
Please, I was just going to say, yeah, I see
Okay.
you unmuting.
Yeah, and there may be something that I forgot to explain where we introduced the model, is that the model has two different contexts. One is generated based on historical data. So based on the model is quite simple. It resumes risk to three elements: hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. And the hazard is based in a historical data sets that put together the different types of hazard exposures over the different time frames, and we compute everything. It's a probabilistic model that computes multiple potential and probable scenarios. Then after conducting this analysis, there is a second layer of analysis that tries to understand what is the impact of climate. And for that, we use two different two different scenarios. One is an optimistic scenario when we manage to reduce the carbon emissions. And then we have a second scenario that is the pessimistic scenario. What happens if we don't reduce carbon emissions? And based on that, we try to estimate what could be how the average number of people displaced could change in these two different scenarios, and with these two different approaches, the one of optimistic approach with climate scenarios, or a pessimistic approach. I hope that explains or answers the question. And there are different data sets that are used in the model for different types of hazards. So drought is going to have a different hazard exposure model, input data sets, the same for floods and wildfires. So we don't compute for the model all the different hazards at the same time. The different hazards are computed with different input data sets.
Thanks for that. And I'm actually going to, unless anyone else is dying to jump in, I want to keep us moving through some additional questions. I think you added a lot there, Maria Teresa. There's another question from Patrick Michael Brock on the applications of the IDMC model at the outputs of what you've done. And so he writes, it sounds like the need or the use cases for the historical analysis is at national level, is for national level aggregate data, and that the use case for forward-looking risk analysis is more subnational. Is that a correct way to understand it, and other bespoke validation data collection exercises happening in parallel to strengthen the risk models?
Yeah, I was about to answer that question in the chat. It's a very good question, Patty. Actually, the global risk model that we published takes two different geographies into consideration: the national estimates and the subnational estimates. Because having like a national indicator of what is the risk of displacement is interesting, because it can help you to prioritize one country over another. But you need more than that. You need to know where in which country you need to focus your attention, the preparedness resources, right? That's why the model has these two different geographies, national level and admin one. We didn't go beyond admin one because of the limitations of the baseline data sets that we use for the model that have a very coarse resolution. However, the historical analysis of trends of displacement can actually inform forward-looking approaches as well, and forecasting and anticipatory action mechanisms. That's why we have been investing a lot in improving and enhancing the time series by backfilling gaps, disaggregating the data temporarily, but also geographically, because you need to know where to focus attention. In a country that is as big as Australia, if you just present a metric that there is people at risk in Australia, you get lost. It's such a big geography that you need to have more granular information. And that's why the reporting that we are publishing and the monitoring that we conduct is focusing more and more in highly disaggregated data to answer these questions and allow better actions and measures to reduce and address internal displacement at a more granular resolution. I hope that answers the question. Please let me know if you want me to expand.
I think that's great, and I'm going to actually end on a question that I don't want to say it's not a broader question, but situates this in our broader political context. And this is from Mnet at Save the Children, who's posing the question of, do you think how much of the is the issue lie more with a lack of political will here? And this is one that I think Laura and Jamon can come in on. would the existing data be sufficient to address, to a large extent, the risks of climate change on vulnerable communities and groups? Her concern is that policy and decision makers may use the excuse of lack of data to justify inaction. So curious your takes from a applicability and kind of seeing what you've seen with this data in action in other political contexts.
I can
Go ahead,
just
Jamon.
briefly comment. I replied to Mnet in the question as well, but in the comment rather. I mean, I think that is, of course, totally true. It's all about will, but I don't think the data are at that level where we start trying to align questions of, we don't have the full picture with exposure, vulnerability, adaptation, mitigation, coping capacity. We really struggle with about, I would say, everything except exposure. And some of the work that Maria Teresa was just describing is great to talk about these different risk profiles, but knowing what resources are available and really knowing how people respond to this themselves. IDMC, IOM, UNHCR, government leadership, camp leadership can tell you, do this. Will people do it? How will they respond? These are totally different challenges, and we just don't know really how those connect. There's another concern here, Mnet, which you tipped me off to as well, which was when we have climate hazards or extreme weather, going back to Manuel's question, when it's difficult to know, is it extreme weather? Is it hazards? Is it conflict? Is it persecution driving this? In many countries, thinking of Ethiopia, for example, we have all of these displacement profiles mixed up on the landscape, and some settlements are differently used for different kinds of populations driven for different reasons. Leadership can exploit this as well. They can absolve themselves of culpability for their actions by saying, oh, that, of course, that was a flood, it was a drought, it was a bad season, etc. So there's this other mixing up of not being able to properly attribute and know for accountability purposes what caused this displacement that's very worrisome. And we have probably zero idea of how often that happens, but you know it's happening, you know it has happened. We just don't have any lead on it right now.
Thanks, Jamie. Laura, we'll give you the last word to help close us out as well. No pressure.
Sure. I think, yeah. So I'm not a data person. I'm really like a programming and policy person who wants to use the data. And so from my perspective, I think we're never going to have enough data. You know, we can always do a better job. We can always get a better picture. There are always going to be gaps, which we should 100% be trying to fill. But at the same time, we do have solid data and evidence to make a strong case for why prioritizing children in the context of climate change and climate mobility makes sense. It's not just another vulnerable group, which is often sort of the write-off, just including another vulnerable group. It's actually a strategy to build more resilient families, more resilient communities, and stronger economies overall to support young people to be in a position to really thrive and contribute to their communities and economies. So I think changing the narrative around this is really key, that it's not just, it's an opportunity as well in order to build the resilience of children and young people and prepare them to really have the skills needed to live in a climate change world, to contribute to their own communities and support to adapt, but also have skills ready to integrate into a host community and to then support that community to grow and to thrive. And I think also this focus on children can sometimes help cut through some of the tricky politics that we see when it comes to climate change, when it comes to migration, and we face all of these political challenges. So I guess my call to those joining today would really be to come together around this priority of putting children at the center of climate action, increasing financing, providing the policy space, giving them a seat at the table, and of course, helping to really generate better evidence, tracking children, how they move to build that evidence base in order to move the needle and to really support efforts around climate mitigation, adaptation, and addressing loss and damage as well. Over.
Thank you. I wish we had more time. That was a great way to end. And I also an invitation, which I think you've all offered to colleagues to to get involved. We have many practitioners and people from a range of organizations and academic institutions and agencies that I know could benefit from the work you're doing and could contribute. So we would love to hear from you. We will help make connections. And we were also curious what topic out next in our series. So with that, I know I'm representing a whole number of the over 100 people who joined today to say thank you, Laura, Maria Teresa, and Jamon for sharing your work with us and your perspectives and experience. So thank you. We will look forward to seeing everyone on our next call.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks again.
Thanks.